Indonesia's government is often known to be rather ambitious. They have always tried for efficiency, buying infrastructure initiatives, and ultimately improving the economy. This in turn helped push Indonesia to where it is today. It is regarded as one of the largest economies in the entire world, and is expected to become one of the superpowers in the next decades. Becoming an economic powerhouse, however, is going to be difficult. The government will need to manage the country properly through its allocations on government spending. On doing so, they will need to improve the overall state budget by implementing various policies to support revenue streams. As of the latest data, however, this does not seem to be the case. According to the official figures released by the Finance Ministry, the current overall government revenue generated in 2021 amounted to just over 2,000 trillion rupiah, or 140 billion US dollars. This measly government-generated money still has a lot of holes within them, as the country is equipped with a massive population, yet its annual government revenues does not seem to match its current landscape. Nevertheless, this figure has steadily increased over the years, as 2020's annual revenue was just $110 billion, suggesting a 21% increase from that year to the next. On the other hand, how Indonesia generates this much money every year is due to a lot of factors. The first is because of tax revenues, a crucial component, as this is where the majority of the money generated by the government comes from. Tax revenue that was gathered in 2021 was about $104 billion. This comes from a long list of tax sources, such as individual income, corporate, value-added, and other forms of taxes. The remainder of where the government makes money is from natural resource revenue. As Indonesians know, it is influenced mainly by the abundance of oil and natural gas, but not limited to such as the country's natural resources are vast. These natural resource commodities are also tied to both domestic consumption, where businesses use these commodities to improve their business, and indirectly influencing the economy, and also through exports, as these commodities are also being bought off by foreign entities. These have made the government around $8 billion. Further, the government also makes money from its state assets. These government-owned assets, or what is locally known as state-owned enterprises, have collectively generated just a sheer sum of about $2.5 billion. While it is known that these enterprises are significant and generate more revenues, what the government receives annually is just a small dividend. These two and a few more are its non-tax revenues, which accounted for the remaining $36 billion that the government generated in 2021. These two collectively bring up the entire $140 billion money that the government makes, and also do note that it is money generated in one fiscal year. With a large budget, the government must also spend it. In 2021, the government spent a whopping 2,786 trillion rupiahs, or 187 billion US dollars, which is about $47 billion more than what it had generated in the same year. Now, why the government decided to do what will be discussed later, along with an explanation on the implications of having to spend too much. We must first talk about where the government spent this $187 billion in just one year. Government spending is usually spread across different agencies, which is also again divided across thousands upon thousands of different government-related offices. The largest, however, of where the budget went to in 2021 was directed towards the Ministry of Public Works and Public Housing, where it had received over $10 billion worth of funding. And as its name suggests, this ministry delves into the construction of houses to water resources. The second and third largest, on the other hand, are surprising. The budget allocated to the Ministry of Military, Defense and Police Force makes up a collective budget of $17 billion. A massive amount that most likely raises questions such as, why not just spend more money on education or healthcare, rather than military equipment? Well, such matters, however, is a difficult question to answer. After all, each nation is very unique and may need to cater to their own domestic problems. This leads us to how much the government spent on these two mentioned ministries. The Ministry of Education just received around $5.4 billion, whereas the Ministry of Health received $5.7 billion. These two are amongst the most important in one society. For now, however, the collective budget allocated in those few industries that we mentioned have accounted for $40 billion in the government's 2021 budget, and these are also amongst the top agencies that receive the highest budget. Back to our topic earlier, the government is in a significant deficit, meaning they spend more than what they make. This has been consistently happening for tens of years now. Data from 2015 till 2021 has even seen its deficit grow more considerably. In 2015, the government just spent $20 billion more than what it made, but by 2021, it had more than doubled to roughly $47 billion. Most may now wonder, is this a bad thing? Is the government spending more than what it makes a bad economic policy? Well, this so-called budget deficit is actually normal. It applies to many nations around the world, and even to corporations. A budget deficit usually means that they're trying to stimulate the economy by constructing infrastructures, houses, schools, or improving the entire healthcare system. These are evident across Indonesia. The government has employed numerous programs to improve the entire economy. Take, for example, Joko Widodo's ambitious infrastructure drive. The government has likely spent money on these projects. How the government can do this is through the borrowing of capital domestically or externally. They would go on to raise money using a myriad of instruments, which in turn also increases the overall debt of Indonesia. While it may sound like something that should not happen, it is in fact okay. If Indonesia implemented various programs, say its infrastructure was successful, it would eventually make enough money to pay down the debt it had gotten in the first place. It can do so through direct effects, where the infrastructure generates money back to the government, or could also do it indirectly, by increasing tax revenues as impacted by an increase of productivity. The only issue, however, is that if the government's deficit becomes too much, debt would understandably become an enormous burden to the country. That is very unlikely, as Indonesian fiscal policies are tight, and its overall economic status is very bright. However, suppose the government still fails to rightfully implement the right programs and increase the nation's economy. In that case, it will have to rely on either option, such as increasing taxes, selling its state-owned enterprises, or taking more debt to pay down its debts. The only issue with what we're seeing right now is that while Indonesia's government revenue may seem big, it is actually small. The total tax revenue collected as a percentage of the GDP of Indonesia sits just at 11.5%, one of the lowest in the entire world. It is the second lowest in the Southeast Asian bloc, just behind Myanmar, which is undergoing a political crisis. Even its counterparts, the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia, sit at 14.2%, 17%, and 13.6% respectively. This, in simpler terms, means that Indonesia is not generating enough tax revenues. Furthermore, government revenues, compared to the OECD nations, have shown that Indonesia is the lowest in generating government revenues. So why is Indonesia's tax revenue so low? Well, we could pinpoint numerous answers to this question. This can be due to an inefficient system, in which numerous tax evasions may be employed. But the very microscopic details are pretty hard to pinpoint. Corruption could be in play. The very rich could be hiding their wealth, and so on. What should be clear is that tax revenue must be fixed, as it will more than likely help push numerous changes within the country. After all, if tax revenues doubled from here on out, it would mean that Indonesia's government would have nearly $300 billion in annual revenues, which would help it to pursue further goals and lower deficits. Keep in mind that this is not impossible. Numerous countries have more than 20% in tax revenues as a percentage of their GDP. They are not singled out in just developed nations, as it is also evident across developing ones. Anyways, these are our opinions on what opportunities there are that Indonesia can dive into. As good government budget allocations, finding to increase tax revenues and improving government investments are all possibilities. But do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.